Sure the bell's not going to start again. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good morning. A most unusual use of the church. Hopefully it's okay. Today started reasonably average for me. I got up and found I didn't have a belt to hold my trousers up, but Maria and Ray came to the rescue. Otherwise it was going to be a piece of string. So we're going to do this discussion in two parts. We're going to have this piece here, and then later on in the day, out in the marquee in Annestown, we'll do sort of part two. So this is really the bit for those who are wondering who the Beresfords are, and secondly, to try and bring together several generations. So there's people here who haven't been to Annestown for 150 years, and it's good for that generation and John and Morris and all of their family to have a few minutes here, look at the grave. It may be an unusual place to start with a grave, but actually in Ireland, because so much of the documentation has been lost in the forecourts, the church and graves are probably one of the main sources where you can find written information. And while my sister Margaret has dug up a lot of historical documents out of Annestown, you're still relying largely on what you can find in churches, and the marriage and baptismal records don't go back that far. So somewhere around 1850, it's all over, and you then got to be lucky. So we are, as a family, we are most unusual in that we can go back to the Battle of Hastings, 1066. So it's a long time. There's one wobbly bit in the middle where I'm not entirely certain. I'm only about 80% certain. But other than that, we have an absolute straight line back to 1066. And that's what I'm going to do this morning, to take you through that piece of it. This afternoon, I'll take you through a little bit of the Annestown story, the piece of land down there, how it started, where the people came from. We'll do that later on. So today, we're going to go back to the very beginning and work our way forward to the Beresfords in Dungarvan and then in Annestown. But we'll leave Annestown more or less blank until later on in the day. First 2 minutes maybe. So with the help of a couple of people in this room, we're going to try and put what I've got written and handed around to most of you on a blog on the net February next year. And we're going to call it the Beresford Storybook, because it's essentially about, to make it interesting, if you don't base it around people, you're pretty lost on a chart that says this, it's all over in 2 minutes. So Shane and Mayor, Damien and others are going to help me put together what we have written on the internet so that we can continue to add to it over the years. So I'm going to go back to somewhere around 700-800 AD. So it's a long way back, and I'll tell you what was happening then, because if you don't understand what was happening then, you probably won't understand what happened later on in Ireland and Beresfords in particular. So around 700, 800, we had a similar crisis in Scandinavian countries as we do today in the Arab countries, and particularly in Iraq, etc., where people were migrating due to economic pressure. So the Vikings, as we call them, so people from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, started to be on the move, and essentially there were too many of them. Around 800, they really started to migrate, and progressively they went to Normandy and became Normans. They came to Ireland and sort of became Irish. There's still a Danish settlement in Waterford that we're going to have a look at soon. They came to England, and they came to a lot of the Middle East states. So they worked their way down to Istanbul, over land, right through Russia. So they scattered everywhere. Ireland wasn't the only country to get a blast of Danes, right? They just went everywhere. So the group that went to northern France, to Normandy, were later obviously called Normans, and they were endlessly in battle with the kings of France. The kings of France gave them control over Normandy on the promise that they would protect the Norman coast from other invaders. So they became semi-French, but also the King of France was in the background. So they had autonomy, and they used the first piece of autonomy to find a bigger piece of land. And essentially, that is where the fragmentation of Europe started, way back then. So 1066, the Normans decided England would be a good place to go. So they bought a fairly small contingent of army. They landed in Hastings, and they annihilated the Saxon King of England. So you now had a position where a small group of people, Normans, they weren't French, they were Normans, were controlling England. And from there on, it became an endless battle between the people who controlled Normandy and England and the French. And then later on, it became a battle 300-400 years later based on religion. So the Spanish and others stayed Catholic, and the majority of the Europeans, so the Germans, parts of Belgium, etc., and England became staunchly Protestant. And Ireland became a pawn in this whole fight between the two sides of the church in England, and between the kings of England, who were part Norman, and then Normandy, and then France itself. So that's the background. So our family came out of the Battle of Hastings. And I'm going to have a shot of this. So we're talking about 1066. Two families took part in that. So one family is called Malbank, M-A-L-B-A-N-K. They ended up with a large amount of real estate in the Chester area. So the city of Nantwich in Chester, that was their hometown. They built the city. And the other family is Bardolph, B-A-R-D-O-L-F. So they were the chancellors of the exchequer to all of the early kings of England. So in particular, King John. So John, who wrote the Magna Carta, gave individual rights to the people, the individual people of England, so 1250 or whatever. He played a huge part in our early family and why we became Beresfords. So in that period of time, you had to fight to be king, and you had to fight to stay king. So in each generation, there was endless aggro between the sons of the kings in France, in Normandy, and the sons of the kings in England as to who had the right to control what piece. So after the Battle of Hastings, the part of the family that gave rise to our name were the Bardolphs. So that family had a small amount of land, as in 100, 200 acres. So they weren't super rich, but they were well connected. They were Chancellor of the Exchequer to the King, and right in amongst the action. The Malbanks had the money. So they got together, and they had a son Hugh Baldoff, and his father was Robert. So Robert got caught up in the wars in Normandy, and King John, who was king at the time, lost the war, and Robert Baldoff was held to ransom. Couldn't pay the ransom. The Normandy kings gave him a choice: either fight for Normandy or you're going to get executed. He was a wise man. He decided he'd fight for Normandy. It was a good decision, right? But his lands in England got largely confiscated. And his aunt, Honora Malbank, so his mother's sister, sorted him out a piece of hiding and a piece of real estate. And he became Hugh of Alstonfield. So in the Peak District in England, Derbyshire, that's where they first started. On the River Dove, he had an estate called, where's he going to? Okay, so I'm not quite sure what the name of the estate was, so I'll come back to that one. He changed his name relatively quickly from Hugh of Alstonfield to Hugh de Beresford. And Beresford is a place name, so it's a bit like Alligator Crossing or something like that. So Bayers crossing the river, Ford, river crossing, that's where it came from. And they were intimidated by King John, and it was only when King John died in 1215 that there was some peace broke out. The name started in 1227, we know it exactly. So there's a couple of hundred years from Battle of Hastings to 1227, 4 complete generations, and we have the name Hugh de Beresford. That's where it comes from. So the first 200 years after that, nothing much of any great interest. So they were country people, they intermarried locally, they were foresters, so Malbank Forest was their home. They were archers in some of the local armies, and they were farmers. So at the time, the archery business, the method of war, was absolutely crucial. Every young man had to give up his time from 2 o'clock on Sunday till 4 o'clock under risk of getting into serious trouble. And you had to go archery practice just like we go and play football now. So there were 7 generations in those first 200 years. 5 of them were called John. Where's my brother John? John, you were well named. 7 generations there. So we come in 1425 to the pivotal man. So Thomas and Agnes Beresford, 1425 to 1470, they had 16 sons and 5 daughters. How about that, eh? So that takes a bit of doing. Not quite sure how you get around to. So they lived at a place called Newton Grange. So a grange is an estate attached to a monastery. So when rich people died, they would bequest their farm or their estate to the local monastery, get to heaven quicker, and the monks for a while used to manage the granges. Then they gave up and rented them out. Farming was too hard. So Thomas got a hold of Newton Grange and another one, but he actually resided at Newton Grange. Son number 6 of the 15 was a guy called Humphrey. And Humphrey is the one that the sons and successors of Humphrey are the ones who came to Ireland. So Thomas, he sorted out careers for all 16 sons, and the bookwork says he had his daughters married off well. So he was quite a smart guy. Newton Grange was 400 acres of great land. There was 2 families, so Thomas and Humphrey and his brothers, one of his brothers stayed there. If you go on 4 generations, you end up with a guy called Michael of Kent. So you're getting further down into England. Michael was an administrator. So he was responsible in the county of Kent for looking after land of young heirs that had whose parents had died. So if there was a young kid who was going to inherit land later on, to make sure the church or somebody else didn't steal it from them, they had an administration system. Michael Beresford of Kent was the man who looked after that in the county of Kent. He was well organized, got married 3 times, he had 13 children, and son number 3 is the important one. Son number three was called Tristram. It's a name that came and sort of went, Tristram. So Tristram was the son who came to Coleraine in Northern Ireland. So I'll tell you the circumstances of how that happened. Here in Ireland at the time, the only 2 standing armies of Gaelic Ireland were in Ulster, the O'Neills and the O'Donnells. Battle of Kinsale happened, we lost. Ray's gang somehow or other lost the unlosable battle. So the Spanish had their army in Kinsale. So Shane Kinsale is sort of west of Cork or whatever. Wrong part of the country. So the army from Spain, Catholic army, landed in the wrong place. The O'Neills and the O'Donnells marched from Northern Ireland down 300 miles down to Kinsale. So Spanish on the inside, English in the middle, and then O'Neills and O'Donnells on the outside, and somehow or other we lost the battle. Afterwards, the O'Neills and O'Donnells went back to Northern Ireland. They survived the battle, they went back, but severely militarily wounded. So in 1604, we had the flight of the Earls. If you've done any Irish history, you'll have come across it. The Earls of Tyrone and Tyrconnell went to the continent. Essentially, the plan was, we'll get another army in Italy or France or whatever, bring it back, fight this war a second time. Well, they weren't able to put an army together, and in 1610, the monarchy at the time decided they couldn't leave Ulster unmanaged, and worked up a plan. So this was the plan. It's very like what you would do now. They put together a venture capital system to pool some money. So the government wasn't going to do it, so they got the City of London to do it. So the City of London went to all of the trade unions, called guilds at the time, and rounded up people to administer and manage parts of Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland was divided out between the guilds. So the Silversmiths Guild, the Sheep Shearers Guild, you name it, they all got a slice of it. And a guy was put in charge of it, of the whole development, but Tristram Beresford was appointed number 2. So that's how he got to Coleraine. He was number 2 in the administration of the plantation of Ulster. And the story moves on from there. Tristram was a smart man. He looked after the haberdashers and drapers guild and looked after himself.